to my heart. So what I wanted us to do today is talk a little bit about our own, like how we make sense of the cross, to be honest. And it could be that you got questions from the presentations that we did. Some of you may have had time or interest or like not been too scared to read this first chapter from Proverbs of Ashes. It's okay if you didn't read it, but I just wanted to kind of create some space for us to be able to talk around, you know, like what's going on in you as you've heard these theories and as you've read, and like where your head and your heart lie. Graciela, please.
Yeah, Mike, first I've got to confess, I have not read any of this, but I grew up and attended a Catholic school for 8 years. So I was a lifelong Catholic, but mainly what I got from the Sisters of the Divine Providence, there was a lot of work about the cross in terms of what it meant to us. It was absolutely at the center of our religious experience. You know, from the fact that you bless yourself, we knelt and blessed ourselves every time we walked into the church. When the Blessed Sacrament was raised up, I mean, all of that, and all of the catechism classes were basically surrounded around the issue of the cross and what Jesus did for us. So that sounds very simplistic maybe, but that's what it means to me.
Thank you. I didn't think it sounds simplistic at all. I mean, it's like a center of being is never simplistic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I don't think so much about the cross as I think about the resurrection and Pentecost. You know, where he has been transformed, because I think that transformation is something that happens to all of us. Mm-hmm. So that is what I focus on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say one last thing. I agree with Tim, but you can't get to the resurrection until you've gone through the cross. I guess somehow, I don't know if that makes, maybe that's too simplistic also, but you got to do one first. Otherwise, the other doesn't. I think someone else had a comment.
I saw Susan's hand go up.
Growing up, we went to whichever church my dad liked the minister. And we didn't do that very often. So I went to the Methodist church, I went to the Presbyterian church. And so I didn't grow up crossing myself. And I never had any instruction on exactly in the Episcopal church when it's appropriate to do that or anything like that. So the thing that draws me is communion. Mm. And when I first went to the Episcopal church, I had a boss invite me to come to his church. And it struck me so much to kneel at the rail and take communion, the body and blood of Christ is what centers me every week. So.
Thank you. I put a weird thing in the chat. It comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 11. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed. So you're witnesses and approve the deeds of your ancestors, for they killed them and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world. It's a tough teaching, right?
Wow.
And I have to admit, like 3 or 4 years ago, I heard this and I thought like, oh, is that what we do in church? Like we venerate the cross whom our ancestors killed Jesus upon. Like, is this about us? I have this tough bit about the cross because I kind of think it's terrible, just to be honest. I kind of think it's awful. And it's you know, I meet people. My last church was built as a low Protestant church on Coronado Island. And there were things in the bylaws that said like, you can't have a cross in front of the stained glass, which was a picture of Christ the Good Shepherd. And you're not allowed to lift the alms basins in the air. And you can't have candles on the Lord's table. And it's not an altar, it's the Lord's table. And the minister is called Mr., not Father. And there's no acolytes. This was like a memorial church after somebody's daughter, and these were the rules. And if the church broke the rules, they forfeited the gift potentially. So like 40 years later, they had to go back to the family and say, will you release these restrictions? Because we like to wear robes and, you know, we'd like to like lift up the alms for God's blessing. And they have this beautiful Tiffany stained glass window of Christ the Good Shepherd. And he's doing this thing, you know, like inviting you into his kingdom. And it came around all the way around South America. It was built in New York by Tiffany, came around South America and was installed there. And somewhere along the way, someone had put like a cross in front of it. And it was terrible. And my mentoring rector had been there 2-3 years and he removed the cross. And he said, look, in the history of the church, this doesn't go here. And it's fighting the architecture. I mean, this building was built so you could see the Good Shepherd, and this little rinky-dink cross is getting in the way of Tiffany's vision for our church, you know? And his thing was always, you can fight the architecture of a church and you'll never win. And I think that's this spot, like, I know I'm kind of like blah, blah, blah on, but I found like, you know, a lot of people really wanted that little, forgive me for saying it, but like chintzy rinky-dink brass cross in front of a window made by Tiffany. And it was just tough. It was tough that people wanted it so bad because they had to have that symbol, and they couldn't just make do with the older symbol, Christ the Good Shepherd. And I see that tension, you know, like I see that tension. And somebody asked me like about, I think if you're a bishop, you have to wear what's called a pectoral cross that hangs down. I don't know if I could wear that. I have to be honest, I don't know. Because it's like wearing an electric chair or a lethal injection, right? That's what it is. Here I'm on video saying this stuff. I have a hard time with it. You know, I have a hard time because we often forget like it's the symbol of imperial dominance, like it's capital punishment. And sorry, but the Gospels got it wrong. I mean, the Romans killed Jesus. That it wasn't the Jewish leaders, it was the Romans. They saw the guy as a threat and they killed him. And that just seems tough to kind of celebrate that. I get the deal that there's no resurrection without Friday. I get that. And I also think sometimes, like, as I'm reading these books, including Proverbs of Ashes, right? Like we can depending how we handle this symbol, we can sacralize violence and we can sacralize oppression, and we can say like, well, bad for Jesus, good for us. And I don't think we always open our hearts to like, what would happen if we didn't kill the guy? Like what if he just lived a normal life? Maybe we could have learned even more from it, you know, so I'm not saying it's bad. I just mean it's really gritty and it's really tough. And, you know, this image, and Bishop Doyle said this, right? Like God interceded for Abraham to not kill Isaac. So for us to normalize and say, well, yeah, look, like God had to kill Jesus, that just seems really tough.
And I don't see why he had to die. I don't really understand that part of it.
I think that's where I'm at, Tim. And my best answer is like, he didn't have to die. And we didn't have to do that, but we did. And I guess I probably fall somewhere all over the map here in some kind of like moral exemplar theory where God just gave us this gift and it was ours to do what we wanted with it. And it's often happens, whether it's me or someone else, we just misuse the gift. We did what we wanted with it. And, I find that resurrection is God's last word. Like we don't get to have the last word, even though we get to have the first response. We don't get to have the last word. I don't know, like, I find that's really true in like loving relationships, and if I say, hey, I'm not going to give you something because I think you'll misuse it, I'll never give anybody anything and I'll never love anybody. But even that is a little bit too tight and neat to talk about what the cross means to me. So it's I don't know, it's just really tough. And that was all over the place. Sorry.
After the resurrection, he was walking with the women, and he was in there with his disciples. So he was still alive, or some version of him was still alive.
Yeah.
So the cross did not stop anything. It just provided some mechanism for him to be reunited with God. Now, it didn't have to happen because I think Ezekiel or Elijah went up to heaven in his human form. So why couldn't Jesus have gone up there in his human form?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's helpful for me to take the had to happen out and just talk about what did happen. Sometimes I think we put so much like fate behind things. And I get why we like to do that, because we like to try to make a coherent story out of an incoherent universe. I mean, I like to do that. But to say, be able to step back from, hey, like it was God's will, instead to say it's what happened, like that's meaningful for me. I think what's tough is, so much of the picture since Constantine has been this shape, and what I appreciate is what people do with this shape. So, what people talk about, there's the vertical dimension of our faith, which we call transcendence, like God is greater than we are, wholly other. And then there's God's immanence, like God is among us. And I've said this before, and I'm sorry, I know I'm a broken record. I've got like one sermon that I'm trying to figure out how to preach. I think that's true of every preacher. But just to inflict this on you again, this really great Catholic writer says, actually, this is a great image for like where God is in life. And the summary is, God is more present in us than we are in ourselves. God is more present in us than we are in ourselves. And the part of God's presence we get is God's immanence. And the part of God's presence we're unaware of is God's transcendence. And I find that so stupefying. The transcendence is not about God being better. It's about God being more present in me than I'm aware of.
Could that also be viewed as a crossroad?
I think so. And so I think really like the goal of faith, right, is to turn the transcendence into immanence. Right? I mean, it's to like wonkify that cross until it becomes parallel. That seems to be the goal of discipleship, right? Is that we're as present in ourselves as God is.
I would like to be as present in myself as God is, Mike.
sometimes I don't want that, because sometimes I just, there's just parts of living that are tough, like, tending to my everyday physical needs it's just tiring. And I get it. It could be holy work, but yeah, it's also just like, oh, here I go again, doing that again. Look, sometimes I think like, oh, I've got to unload the dishwasher again. I just did it 2 days ago. I guess it could be holy, but it's mostly like, couldn't I have waited another day, And you think I got to get up and brush my teeth and take my vitamins, and I'm going to do that again tomorrow. And then the next day, it's just sort of like,
The daily grind, Mike. It's
yeah, I'd like to
5
transcend the
hours.
daily grind. That's what I think. I think that whole idea about God being transcendent as different and above is like wish fulfillment, how I wish I could transcend having to like be embodied.
It seems to me that's looking at life in a really negative fashion, from the standpoint that it's living, it's having a wonderful glass of tea or a glass of wine with him at the end of the day, and just talk about what we did, or emptying the dishwasher. Maybe I'm being silly or corny, or it's not a grind necessarily. I mean, it's just part of what living is. It's okay.
I think it was either Saint Bernadette or Teresa of Avila that found joy in this small task that she did.
Yeah. See, what I like to do there, Tim, and the church that nurtured me was all about escapism.
Well,
One glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away. I really internalized that, so I keep looking for better and better. And my personality really likes to maximize things. Like, instead of what I want, the question is, what's the best? So if I go to like a nice restaurant, I usually don't think like, what would I like to eat? I think like, what's the best thing they make? Like, what's the experience I'm supposed to curate here? Or, like we have I don't know if you've heard of spirit animals before. Like, is this idea like, what animal will be your spirit animal? And I've spent most of my life thinking like, well, which one would be the best? Of course, I'd want to have the alpha animal, like the polar bear. I don't identify with polar bears. I mean, my spirit animal is probably a dog, but I don't want to be a dog, because that's like a normal thing, like I want to be the alpha animal. I want to be like the Sharkon megalodon that can also like has legs and gets on land, like, and this is this wonderful escapism and transcendence. And what I love about the Native American book we're going to read in 10 days is the guy says, look, Native American spirituality is not about transcendence at all. It's about being transformed.
Mike, I enjoy seeing this side of you, and you might enjoy WWE wrestling sometimes.
No, I grew up watching that. And Lila, I did real wrestling. So I can't
I know.
enjoy that. No, I can't enjoy it because I know how fake it is.
It's fake, Mike.
And all the hype of it, all the trash talking.
It's acting, Mike. They all go on to be actors. Dwayne Johnson.
They might as well be politicians, like, because actually they're more civil in WWE with the way they talk about each other than politicians are.
Graciela, I love what you're saying about daily life. And I love your ideas. I don't think they're simple at all. I just want to share with you. And I have struggled with this whole idea of Christ having to die and being washed in the blood of the Lamb my whole life. And I am so finding it so gratifying to explore, to know that the church does offer some options, and that it doesn't have to be my dirty little secret that I don't really want to be washed in the Lamb. It's okay. And I'm glad you brought up the Luke, because I was trying to remember places in the New Testament where there's reference to the ransoming.
Yeah.
And I landed in Romans, which probably was not a good place to land for this, but I just was thinking about how did our Eucharist get all this ransoming language in it? I mean,
I've got a quick answer. Do you want it? Do you want the quick answer?
yes.
It has to do actually with the conflict between the colonies and with England. So, back when we had the revolution, we all of a sudden needed to have like a different way of praying, because we couldn't really pray for the king and queen anymore since we just kind of overthrown them, but that was necessary in the Anglican, the Church of England way of being. You prayed for the king and the queen because the king and the queen were the heads of the church. That was the gift of the English Reformation, right? Not the Pope, but the monarch. I think it's crazy, by the way, even though like I'm in the system. I just think that union of church and state is real scary. But we needed bishops here or we couldn't ordain priests. And so actually the Church of England had a stranglehold on the American church, because if you didn't make an oath to the king or queen, you couldn't be a bishop, you couldn't be a priest, you couldn't make new priests, right, who wouldn't take that oath. So that was the strangle. And we sent, I don't know if you've seen Hamilton, but actually we sent a guy to become bishop who was very opposed to the American Revolution. Samuel Seabury wrote pamphlets saying, do not resist the king. And then he was the one we sent to be the first American bishop. And the Anglican bishops said, no, we're not going to make you bishop. You're not going to take an oath to the crown, no. So it's interesting that the guy who was not in favor of the revolution became the first bishop, but the way he did it was by going to Scotland. And Scotland was very influenced by Catholicism and by, the Yicky atonement of John Calvin. They really line up well. Penal substitutionary atonement was really strong for Calvin. And if you know your Calvinist history, it was so strong, right, that not everybody gets it, because Jesus's blood is so precious, it can't be wasted. That's why some people are just going to hell, because, it's not like Jesus could die for everybody, because not everybody accepts it. So they don't get it. So what happened is they said, we'll make you bishop if you use the Scottish rite. Well, in Thomas Cranmer's Book of Prayer, it was called the Lord's Table, and it was about strength for the journey. But in the first prayer book that Samuel Seabury wrote for the Episcopal Church, it was about altar and sacrifice, because that was the language of Scotland.
So there we are. So I appreciated you taking us back to the Luke today.
Yeah.
And as Bishop Doyle said when he was here, that's what Jerusalem did. It killed prophets, and it killed this one too.
Yeah, I think at a certain point, like, we accept that that's the case, but we also say, and that's not okay. You know what I mean? Like,
yes,
it does happen, and it's like shouldn't continue to happen.
Right. So in that frame of reference, I can understand the parallel or the with Abraham and Isaac and God and Christ, because God didn't kill Christ, the Jews didn't kill Christ. It was politically motivated.
Yeah.
The empire, right? So that settles my brain a little bit, but I'm really looking for something more visceral here. And it, to borrow Graciella's phrase, simpler, although I don't think what she was saying was at all simple. I think it was very much from her heart. And so I'm looking for that. And so, I found in the Romans personification of sin, which is totally opaque for me in another topic, but that God's first Bible is the creation, which feels so right to me because I see God in the creation. It's easy for me to connect with God in nature, in the stars, and so on. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's was Duns Scotus's jumping off point or not, but certainly the Franciscan idea is the most appealing to me. But even Paul talks about expiation by blood, but then he talks about we are justified by faith, not blood. We were all children of Abraham because he was justified by faith, not circumcision or blood. Jesus was put to death for our sins and raised for our justification. Therefore, we are now justified by his blood. Much more shall we be saved from the wrath of God.
Yeah.
It's the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life. So it's, I have to say, Mike, I kind of find my brain tossed back to where I often find myself with scripture, and that is, and I'll just take the parts that I can understand, that feel right to me, and gloss the other parts. And I find, I mean, this is very confusing, just this one writing of Paul, and I love Paul so much. But I mean, I just want to read this part where the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Creation is God's first Bible. So I think at some point, somehow, some theologians, some people, I don't know who, in the 1st through 4th centuries, came up with this idea, and then we got the idea of the devil much later, and this trade that had to be made to satisfy divine justice. This devil got all this power, it over us and over the creation, that the devil had to be satisfied with blood and original sin. And I highly respect Augustine, but his biography does not, I mean, I can see why he felt that way about original sin. Just because his life, I mean, he didn't come to God as a young man. Amen. So when we read, do we read back onto the Gospels, onto Paul, onto the Hebrew Bible, even this idea that there must be a blood trade for our souls to be whole, for us to have an eternal life with God, in God, for us to live in the imminence now, to live in the love of God now, this whole worthiness business. And forgive me, I understand I'm all over the map here too. I'm just kind of trying to stretch for words that make sense, but that will also match what I feel in my heart.
Yeah.
That when Paul talked about ransom, when the Gospels talk about ransom, Christ died for us. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, I don't think they meant this business. I mean, they didn't have an idea of the devil. They didn't have that dualism. And I'm kind of aching to have the feeling of what was their relationship with the divine, that they would say what was written, and then later it seems like it's overlaid with this C.S. Lewis, there's a deeper magic that must be satisfied, which I find, I just am repulsed by that.
Yeah.
Because if God is really the final word, how then is the deeper magic the God? And then you still have this, you still are stuck with the same question. Well, why do you need to have this trade? So I understand the very important concept of tradition and scripture and the third experience? Is it
Reason.
reason? Right. And I understand that over centuries, our collective experience of the divine can evolve, and we're going to say different things about it. But man, it sure doesn't seem like in this area it's evolved in a very loving way.
Yeah.
So I think if I had to boil this down, Mike, to one question, it would be what were the authors of our New Testament, what they have in mind with all this ransom talk? And they were all Jewish, right? I mean, Paul was a super Jew, right? Was he not? Like,
That's his claim. That's his own claim. Yeah.
right. He was a champion of the law, knew it backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
So I respect that. But I mean, the whole, the scapegoat business, we've talked about that before. That's not a Jewish interpretation of what the scapegoat was. You would never kill the scapegoat.
Right.
That would mess up the whole thing. Please, somebody say something. What? Are we interpreting something on this ransom language, Mike?
Well,
What's
I think it's always important to remember that language is limited and there's a lot more options, and sometimes we anachronistically read words. So just remember that in Hebrew, sin means missing the mark, but it also means carrying a burden. So when you think about ransom, so what do you need to be ransomed from? Your bad aim or the heavy burden that you're lifting? So hear the words of Jesus, "Come unto me, all ye who are heavy laden, who have sin, who are burdened, and I will give you rest. I will pay your ransom. I will help lift the burden from you." That's really different from hostage taking and appeasement. It's, I will help you carry your burden.
And perhaps his way of helping us carry the burden rather than the cross is his way of life, his teachings of love and acceptance and compassion.
Nonviolence.
Perhaps he knew, he could see ahead. He knew that he was going to die, but that wasn't, for me, that wasn't necessary. My theology is evolving.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, where I am is I tend to lean toward the moral influence, plus some feminist theology, plus Native American theology. There's a blend of that for me. So I'm like you, Lila. I see God in creation. Everything is God. God is not only in creation, but creation is in God, including us. Mm-hmm. So there's that Native American thing, and the deal about giving back to the community. We transform ourselves so that we can give back to the community. And to me, the importance of Jesus was his life. And the importance of the resurrection for me is not, it's not based on the need for the cross, but God's showing us that Jesus's way cannot be destroyed, even with death. So that's kind of where I am today, but don't hold me to it. I'm open for growth and evolution and learning. So I'm all over the place, but it doesn't bother me what other great men or even women have said. That was their view at that time, and I can understand their thinking, but it doesn't have to be mine, and I don't have to reconcile my thinking with theirs just because they have status and influence and some great thoughts, but all of their thoughts aren't necessarily great.
I think it's hard because I can make a lot of the symbolism in like analogy and metaphor. But if we're saying this is a real event, then it gets a little dicier, right? Because it's like somebody actually like dying a horrible death. Like I know how to do that analogically. It's a great analogy. But then when you think like this is like a historical reality, it turns that screw.
It's real blood.
It's like real blood. Yeah. And I think so much of it, again, we come at anachronistically, so forgive me for saying this, right? But like in the Bible, usually when you see the word blood, it doesn't mean real blood. It means life force, like chi. And like we take that so seriously that we've come up with like doctrines around how we're actually drinking Jesus's blood, even though it doesn't look like it, instead of like being full of his life force. And there's those tricky bits, right? Because I just think like Jesus is not exactly a pacifist either. Like he's not. And you've heard me say this, and I'm going to say it again. The most violent thing I've ever seen in my life is my daughter being born. But it's a different kind of violence than how we normally approach, like, you know, like it's not destructive violence. I mean, of course, the sad reality is miscarriages do happen. And some women have all this violence happen to their body and there's no new life at the end of it. So I don't want to like normalize, look, pregnancy is a great thing. I think I want to contrast, and this is where gendered language is important. I don't have it in me physically to be creatively violent in my own body. That's women's experience. But my wife still has a muscle that came detached during delivery from her ribs. It's still detached, and it will always be, right? And there's things like stretch marks, and there's things like stitches that you get, and there's things like, you know, leaking that, I mean, that's perpetual violence against a woman's body. And so I don't think that violence is like, it's not just that Jesus is nonviolent. It's just, I think that there's this different kind of violence that happens. And how do we bear that in ourselves? And how do we, you know, try to not prescribe that on people? That's where this is real, it's just sticky, because if you hold on to anything too tightly, it starts to become prescriptive, and in that sense, really unfair. It's not like a lady who has no kids is inferior to a lady who has 6 kids. But we act like that. You know, it's like, why didn't you have kids? And the assumption is there's something wrong with you. Oh, your body must be, you know what I mean? Like there's all this sort of baggage. And I think everybody on the screen gets this. And that's where we just live in all of this tension. And the cross is just really tense, because there's a lot riding on it, you know. And I don't know, I don't want to like over transition, but if you read this, and I don't expect everybody did, it's really hard. And I'm wondering, like, again, like, it's funny because we do church undifferentiated. We're all in one room, and a general priests are men, and they're up there doing this thing, and then there's all these women. And look, I mean, probably men do need to hear sacrifice yourself, but I'm not sure women need to hear that. You know, like that's the tough bit. And there's that other thing happens, right? Like when we lift up sacrifice, I mean, forgive me for saying this, and I hope that it's not offensive, but when you lift up sacrifice, it really makes 9/11 very understandable. Look, these guys, they didn't have to be faithful every day. They just have to do one thing. And if you really believed in heaven and hell as eternal realities, and you can secure an eternal destiny by doing one thing, forfeiting this sorry life for some good one, Like, of course, that feeds terrorist thinking. That's what happened in the Crusades. You get to be as awful as you want to be. You can kill people, you can maim them, you're doing it for the Lord. So I just see the danger of that thinking. I get this book was really hard, Lila. It was really hard. And if you read the last chapter sort of says, where's God when bad stuff happens to women? And spoiler alert, she sort of says, God's right there, telling the person, stop, 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 stop. And with the woman suffering, like at the same time. And like, that's the best I can do. And it's still not great.
Mike, I so appreciate your grasp of the experience of being female.
I mean, I don't really grasp it. To be really clear, like for all the other things that I'm fluid on, like I am definitely a man in a man's body. Like that's me. I'm cisgender. I've never like been uncomfortable in the male body.
But you're open to the woman's experience. You're open to trying to understand. And that's what I hear Graciela saying she appreciates, and so do I.
Thanks. I hope if you did read the sermons here, you found a few that I didn't mention, like the liberation theology of Jan Sabrino. She talked about that particular model. She talked about Rauschenbusch's idea in here. I mean, really, I thought the sermons that she presented were a really good sort of primer on some multifaceted approaches. And what she does that I think is really interesting is she says, look, this approach takes this part really seriously, which is probably why it's got sticking power. But if you hold on to it real tight, you get these problems, particularly with women. And remember, this is a white woman. And we're reading this book by a Black woman that says, like, white women got a lot of privilege, Black women don't got. So this doesn't even quite do it for us. Like that's where it's sort of the bandwidth of life and theology sometimes is so wide, it's overwhelming.
And I think that's where we come into our problems, is when we hold on to any theology too tightly, when we hold on to the rules, like the rules at your previous church. I mean, there needs to be an openness to others. There needs to be an openness to other ideas. And this is my thinking at this time, not this is the way you should think and believe.
Yeah. I think actually one of the biggest changes that's happened historically happened with the Nicene Creed, because what a lot of people don't realize is how diverse Christianity was for the first 300 years. And then there was this imposition of orthodoxy and heterodoxy with the imperial state behind it. And I think I'm no longer convinced that's a really good thing.
Problematic, Mike.
I think it's problematic. And I think particularly when we say it's about what we believe cognitively instead of how we behave as a community, which is to me like Christian denominationalism's poisoned gift to faith, is that we will push cognitive categories above community behavior. It's tough.
I am much more interested in what my heart feels than what my brain can sort out. Although I do seem drawn like a moth to a flame to this theology of the cross.
Yeah.
I do want to understand, where's the joy? Because I'm quite sure that Jesus lived a joyful life. I'm not sure we see that very often in the writings, but I'm quite sure anyone that was as plugged in as he was had to be living in a state of true joy and oneness with the divine, with his own divine nature, with his own human nature, with the desert that he lived in.
Mm.
So I remind myself to reach for that love and that joy in the midst of when I'm thinking about these other very important concepts. And Mike, you have transformed my experience of the Eucharist with discussing it about nourishment for the journey. Truly, in such a beautiful, beautiful way.
Thank you. I'm listening to a book right now that's the Black version of Brene Brown's work. So it's a collection of essays written by Black authors, male and female. And it's really meant to highlight not Brene's work about shame and vulnerability. They find that applicable, but the joy is to highlight, like, as we think about racial structures, to highlight like what it means to be a Black person. Because Brene speaks from her white female experience. So it's sort of like, what does this look like? And I one of the essays that I read this morning, you could find this a quote attributed to lots of different people online, but she attributed it to Jacques Derrida. Joy is a form of resistance. And the essay sort of says, like, we know the structures are stacked against us. And if we accept that reality, then oppression has absolutely won. So we find joy in resisting. The reality is there and we will not accept it. And to hear that definition of joy, which is not fun, is kind of helpful for me. Because it's joy in that sense is not a feeling, it's an orientation. It's a set of practices. And I wonder if that isn't, I also am really, it's really hard because, like, we love as Americans, our number one favorite, like, metaphor analogy is about struggle and, like, I'm not giving up the fight, and like everything is just conflict. And I'm not really convinced that everything has to be so conflictual, but I do hear this thought of it. Joy is a form of resistance. And I think, like, maybe sometimes that can be helpful language because, to remain open to something bigger, it does require resisting, settling in where you are. If you resist too much, then I don't know that you can have joy. Like, if everything's a struggle, I don't know, but it's one part of that coin, right?
Or isn't for the African American, isn't there hymns or spirituals, something of joy? And that's how they used it, exactly like you're saying it, to fight oppression.
Yeah. What's really interesting, Tim, I got this lecture like 6 years ago. There was a guy who came to our little teeny tiny Episcopal school in Coronado, had like 90 students, kind of like this one. And he was singing spirituals. And he was like, well, let me tell you what the spiritual means. When I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun, that was telling people in the fields when to run away. But these were songs that you sang while you were doing forced labor, but they were also encoded with when to get to the Underground Railroad. So sometimes they change it. When I fall on my knees with my face to the setting sun, or to the night's full moon, or whatever it was telling people this is when you get to go. And I'd never heard that, and to hear that they were using the language of their oppressors in front of them, also with a way of liberation. That seems to be that definition of joy. And I've got to say, and I've been here for like 6 years, I grew up hearing the song, but for me, when I think about the cross, the song is Were You There? Because of that sign, it causes me to tremble. I mean, there's so much power in that lyric to me.
Has anyone seen the Underground Railroad on Amazon or read that book?
I've got it in my library queue. It's next.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, you told me about it this week, so I
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
Did I?
You mentioned it on Tuesday.
Oh.
So I queued it up.
Well, I'd love to know what you think and how violent it is. I think it's pretty violent, graphic, but so the times were, right? It sounds really fascinating, though, the way that book is constructed with the different stops.
Yeah.
Have you guys, are you familiar, you guys, with that? It's, Mike, can you speak to it? I really don't know too much about it other than it's a book, I don't know, published in the past 2 years, I think, about
Colson Whitehead, right?
Forgive me. I've already told you more about it than I know.
It's a historical fiction novel published in 2016. I'll get it read in the next 2 weeks and let you know.
Book report. Oh, homework for Mike. Oh, well, it's this fictionalized account where there are stops on the Underground Railroad, and it's an actual railroad, and it's actually underground like a subway, and you get on it to go to freedom. But there's these stops at these different locations that have where things happen, and there's different meaning to each stop. I don't know what the stops are. I'm gonna have to read it and just risk some nightmares, I think.
Yeah. Can I ask you, again, I know not everybody read this, but anybody who did read it, would you be willing to speak to your experience of it?
I loved the book. I read the whole book.
Whole book, yeah.
But it was an emotional read.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because there was so much detail about the personal lives of the authors,
yeah,
and detail about their personal experience of abuse. I'm used to hearing that in my work, but it's still painful for me to read and vicariously experience that through someone else's pain and story. But I loved seeing how their history, their culture, their experiences of pain and joy led to the evolution of their own theology. There were parts of it that were so difficult to read that I just skimmed them. Yeah. I'd read the first sentence of the paragraph and then skip to the next paragraph because I could see what was coming. And so I had to take care of myself as I read. But it was worth the effort for me to see the evolution of their theology. And to me, it gave me an okay sign that my theology has evolved and will continue to evolve.
What book are we talking about?
Proverbs of Ashes.
Proverbs of Ashes.
Mm-hmm. I don't recommend it lightly, although I'll say it was one of the most important books in my own formation. I took a class called Issues of Women in the Christian Tradition, which really should have been named Global Feminism. And this was a book that we read in that class, and one of my classmates was kind of reliving and making meaning out of having been abused by a sibling, sexually abused by a sibling. And I had a strong relationship with that friend, and this book is about that. I mean, it's about those kinds of experiences. So it was very, I can't even, emotional is not the right word. It was transformative, because it does a lot of deconstruction. Honestly, it's a strong deconstruction of theology that can look the other way. So it was really, really tough, and it was one of those books for me that kind of awakened a reality of women's experience really being very different, and ways in which honestly, like, churches harmed women, just categorically harmed women, especially because this classmate had chosen to trust me with this information. And really hard for me as a man, because I couldn't fix that problem. I have a math degree, but I should have had an engineering degree, because I like fixing problems. I don't like making new ones up. Mathematicians make up new problems every day, and engineers solve them. And so, it's this really big problem to have somebody trust you with this gritty wound that you can't fix. And I want to fix things, like solving problems. It makes the world a better place. Who doesn't want to do that? Like, hearing a problem and saying like that's unsolvable, not fun for my engineering brain. And so that was like a life transition for me too. I still get into a lot of trouble as a husband and a priest and a friend when people tell me something, and I immediately think like, you should try this, because I just love solving problems. Love it.
So how do you put a balm over someone's grief or trauma?
Not your job. You don't have that. You don't have that balm in you. You don't have it.
I think we do. I think we do, Mike. I think that's all. No, I think we do, Mike.
I think one of the lessons of the book is that neither of these women or other women who have been so brutally or abused in any way can fix, that can't be fixed. It permeates the rest of their life. It permeates their being. It permeates who they are, who they see themselves as a person. And it was a process for them of learning to redefine who they were in terms of that abuse, and to learn to live with it, learn to see it for what it was, and learn to not let it have the power to destroy their lives. Learning how to tame it, how to manage it, but it will always be a part of their lives.
And that's where I don't think we have the balm to undo that. And maybe the balm is just, I see your wound and I don't have that wound. And
I am here with you in that wound. I will be with you as you walk this path.
And I think what's so hard about doing that, right, is that when you enter into that space with somebody, you enter into a pain that you can't solve. And when you choose to actually enter it, it's now also your pain.
Yes. There's a vicarious trauma that goes with that.
Yeah.
Knowing, understanding, being with that person.
Maybe that's why we don't like to do it, because that means we have to hurt indefinitely as well, because it's an indefinite hurt, right? And I get that. Hey, look, part of like forgiveness is saying like, I am who I am, and I'm grateful for who I am, even though these awful things happened, but I don't want to seek out awful things either. Like it's tough.
Father Mike.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, you mentioned the song, Were You There?
Mm-hmm.
That is the most magnificent, beautiful song ever. At St. Bernadette's, it was always done on Good Friday. And I haven't heard it in a long time. I don't know if our musicians can do that or know it, but that is a wonderful tear. It's just moving. It's just powerful.
We actually frame the whole Maundy Thursday with a Graziola. We start with, were you there when he knelt and washed their feet? It
Yeah.
causes me to tremble.
Yes.
Were you there when he shared the wine and bread?
Somehow
Were you
that-
there when they sold him with a kiss?
Yes,
Right, so I made those verses up.
you did.
All causes to tremble.
No, it's powerful. It's wonderful.
Mike, you were inspired to those verses.
I don't know what that means.
It means you were inspired to create those verses
Oh.
and add them out of your love and your faith and your experience of ritual.
Yeah, and I think maybe another verse, right, is like, when we enter into empathy, it causes me to tremble,
Yes.
right? Listen, I've got to give another really, really brilliant sermon. And to do that, I've got to put in my dress. I so appreciate you all, and I look forward to continuing this conversation, not just across the weeks, but across the years, because this is one we're just going to come back to over and over and over and over again. And if you're reading, this is this is really the ultimate chapter in Sisters in the Wilderness, the one we're reading on Wednesday. If you can only read one chapter, read chapter 6. That's where we talk about the Black female experience of the cross, right? And then the next weeks after that, like 3 weeks after that, we'll talk about the Native American experience of it as well. And so I hope you find this really, really helpful. Always grateful for your participation and your coming back in not just your thoughts, but your faith. See you guys soon.